Right as the world goes is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Thucydides. Rules, norms, institutions, those are technologies. They reduce friction, they create predictability, and they raise the cost of coercion. But only when they're backed by something harder than good intentions, credible power, aligned allies, and a shared belief that violations actually carry consequences. The uncomfortable truth is that international order doesn't repeal Thucydides, just fences him in at the margins. And when those fences fail, his argument snaps back into place. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that provides you an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world and ask how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's January 5th, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I'm great, Eric. Good morning. Wow, really 2025, 2026. Look at me.
2026. Yep. Happy New Year.
Hey, so far so good on my wardrobe diversity pseudo resolution. I have no idea what color other people are seeing, but this is a decidedly green, not blue shirt, totally green shirt. Let's see what else. My Duke women's basketball team, after a really tough start to the season where they were ranked number 7 and then fell completely out after a bunch of losses, have had 3 really big ones, especially yesterday against Notre Dame. And I don't think they've beaten Notre Dame in a while. So go Devils and go Coach Kara, the new coach of the U.S. Olympic team. So that's pretty exciting. And then on kind of the bummer news is that your Cowboys and my Commanders, again, horrible name, are on the outside looking in of the NFL playoff. So
Yeah, I'm over that.
yeah,
I was over that week 1, I think. Cowboys are just continuing to disappoint. But some good football being played and some good teams. You know, a lot of divisions coming down to the wire last game. I mean, making week 18 actually matter. That's pretty cool.
You're right. A lot of fun teams to watch. You're right. Okay, way to be optimistic. Way to be bright and sunny.
Yeah.
I guess my other banter before we get going is, in light of your outstanding cold open, I love that. My dad, I think probably once a month would always tell us, you all really need to read Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War. And so, totally. It was just that, and we should have majored in economics in college. But we promised that what we were going to do this week was a romp around the world. I want to offer ahead of time that the set of geopolitical actions that the Trump administration has engaged in over the past month, if we view it as a collective, I think these actions are quite clear evidence of our national security strategy. And so maybe we can, by bundling together, do some revealing of that. And my bottom line up front, because I do remember the DI style guide from my time as an analyst at the CIA, where you don't do dark and stormy night, you tell people what you're going to say. I think under President Trump, the U.S. national security strategy is organized around power, leverage, and material advantage, rather than democracy protection or humanitarian norms. When we think about this, what we see are values that appear instrumentally invoked when they're useful and disregarded when they're constraining. Strategy is revealed through trade-offs, not rhetoric. We're going to talk, and I'm going to talk today a lot about scarcity as the central organizing theory of the current decision makers. And when I say scarcity of resources or scarcity of geography, industrial capacity, policy, and even attention. And then the big, kind of tagline here is this is a break from a post-Cold War values-based strategy that has kind of prevailed over previous administrations. So if it feels so weird, I think, in fact, it is different. I do think this is useful for us to consider because I think the old lens is failing us, or it's making everything unprecedented where we seem to, be like, what? How could that be happening? But if you look at this, there is a consistency, I think, that we're going to try and frame. I will also say that values-based frameworks aren't reliably predicting outcomes for us anymore. Alliance language is obscuring transactional behavior. And humanitarian arguments are neither necessary nor sufficient to explain the action that we have, even when they get thrown out as kind of a sop to kind of an old way of thinking. Anyway.
Sounds like you listened to your dad and got that economics degree. All this talk of
Yeah.
scarcity.
Yeah, that's me. It is an old economic theory, but I see
That's
if
like
it
day
works.
one every economics class, scarcity.
Yeah. Well, throw the flag on it if you think I go too far with this, and then maybe our listeners will too.
No, I think it's right in line. All right, let's get to the headlines or to the romping.
It's a romp around the world, yeah, a romp around the world. And a group of others, that's a romp happening. We're chasing down the why beneath the world. Turn the context into something you can hold. It's a romp around the world.
I think folks are well abreast of the developments over the weekend. The law enforcement operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, the former leader of Venezuela. First off, one of my predictions of 2026 came true. That was kinetic action in Venezuela. I was almost wrong because they launched on Christmas Day and New Year's, but weather scrubbed. Planes and aircraft launched from 20 different sites. Pretty cool military operation, but like all decision quality, just because you had a good outcome doesn't necessarily mean it was a good decision. What do you think on Venezuela?
So many things, and there's a lot of chaff being thrown up in all the discussions, whether it's what President Trump says is going on or how Marco Rubio clarifies or Tom Cotton reframes. A law enforcement action, I don't know, with Chinooks and F-35s and explosions, I'm not sure I'm buying that one.
Delta Force law enforcement operation.
Yeah, there may be some benefit on the drug trafficking, and Maduro is certainly a bad guy. But I think at the end of the day, this is about resources and not actually resource scarcity, because as the president keeps reminding everybody, we have all that we need more than anyone else, and ours is better than anyone's. But there is a bunch of access denial. In other words, taking our adversaries and saying, you don't get to have access to that oil and those resources in the way that you have, because in a sense, we have allowed, through our inaction in the region and through decisions made by first Chavez and then reinforced by Maduro, to let Iran and China and Russia all come in. That does threaten us in a certain way. So I think this really is about hemispheric dominance, and it is about denying access to adversaries and competitors much more than anything else. And brief digression on this. This line that we're taking back what was stolen from us, that is just, listen, what he's really saying is back previous to Chavez, we and our U.S. oil companies were in Venezuela building out the infrastructure and deriving advantage from that participation. And when Chavez nationalized it, we were kicked out. And so I guess his exclusion as a kind of theft is an interesting construct. That's really what he's saying. There isn't anything to be returned, and we had no right to the oil that's under Venezuela. This is about money. I think he's made it very clear that U.S. oil companies are going to go in and they're going to make a lot of money. And while they may have to put some initial investment in, he intends to take the proceeds, not give them back to Venezuela, but to take them for ourselves and for those companies to build it out. I don't understand this idea about running Venezuela, that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela. I don't understand how we think that this is fundamentally different from the regime change that we effected in Iraq, even though they assert that it's not. So let's be clear what it's about. It's about denying access to resources by adversaries and creating or overcoming the scarcity of dominance in the region. But whether we're going to be able to pull it off, whether we're going to get mired, whether it's going to go as badly as every other regime change we have ever engaged in, I think that all remains to be seen and will unfold. What do you think? Do I see this clearly?
Yeah, we're putting a lot of faith in the former vice president, Rodriguez, and our ability to work with her. And externally in Venezuela, she's saying a very different thing than reportedly what she's saying to Marco Rubio and to the administration. I don't know how you can trust this lady, right? I think this is going to be a lot muddier than
Of course it is.
the administration anticipates, right? One big flashy action, right? Really well executed mission. Awesome for everybody
Totally.
that participated in the big mish. But from a now what do we do?
Yeah, and there's no the idea that we have some magical power to be able to take years of corruption and a
Yeah.
corrupt regime that is still there, and we've just ceded power to one of the members of that regime. And even if we coerce them into behaviors that are favorable to us, we know that if you end up denying, if you take that not super sound regime and you institute an approach of denial to adversaries and competitors, then you lead to black markets and corruption and money coming in from the side and skirting around it. This is just, great word, murky, how that's going to be affected. So I think this administration would like you to believe that this is positive precedent. I think the president said on Air Force One last night even, hey, listen, we're the only ones that can pull off this kind of operation. We can pretty much do whatever we want. No one can stop us from doing it. I guess that's kind of a positive precedent. If you think U.S. dominance and imperialism is the way that we want to go back to, I think there are also some real negative precedents in here. There are going to be some other people that have a voice. I think we've already started to hear people saying, wait, this is the world we're now in? Well, what's to keep Russia from China just deciding that they're going to start doing that with their neighboring regions? And we declare the Western Hemisphere ours. Are they going to declare the Eastern Hemisphere theirs and they can do whatever they want? And this is a question the president would ask in the Oval when I was there. He's like, why are we there? And the answer is because, why do we engage in these kind of global activities? And the answer is because we have, in fact, seen what happens when the U.S. withdraws from participation in kind of global order. So I think there's a lot of negative precedent here. There are lots of signals to watch, and I think we'll be talking about them over the next, certainly 6 months, if not longer.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, the precedent setting is really concerning, right? Because we may be strongest, debatably, but China and Russia are also strong, right?
Yeah.
And so if the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, then we'll see what happens.
I think we're going to see that Venezuela shows modern power isn't necessarily about who owns the resources, but who controls access to them. And when we introduce the idea of water, there are others that really come into play here, and we're not the only one that have the ability to control access to resources.
We got 6 more hotspots, so buckle up. We'll move to the Middle East and Iran now. Over the past week, protests that began with bizarre merchants over a collapse in currency and soaring prices have spread to students and cities across the country. Inflation's around 40%, and the Iranian rial at record lows compared to the U.S. dollar. The death toll is reported to be in the mid to high teens, with hundreds arrested, and Iran's leadership's kind of split between concessionary language and their traditional crackdown posture. Language outside the country hasn't softened much since the summer, though, with the Iranian president saying, quote, "We are in a full-scale war with the U.S., Israel, and Europe. They don't want our country to remain stable." Then a few days ago, in response to the protests, President Trump on Truth Social at 1:58 a.m., one of his middle-of-the-night truths, if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Iran has also condemned U.S. action in Venezuela. So, Sue, does the U.S. rescue rhetoric help the protesters, or does that give Tehran the foreign plot justification it wants to suppress them?
I think it does a little for the protesters, and maybe if we were to actually do it, gives Iran exactly what it wants, which it always tries to do, is to suck us into something that then they can use against us with other people that are looking at their activities. I think for our audience, the thing to understand about Iran is they operate as a patient, asymmetric power, and they leverage energy, choke points, and nuclear latency and regional proxies. Iran is really a strategist of disruption, not of conquest. They participate globally, but their interests are regional. And so when I think that this reveals about U.S. strategy is what we said in a kind of our opening discourse, is you're going to hear humanitarian rhetoric. But what really this is about is just keeping Iran on edge so that they don't go to the extreme of whether that's their proxy fighting or their nuclear exchanges. And so I think the kind of precedent setting here, and I'll go with my good, bad strategy. The good precedent is it's always good to avoid major war. And so reaching out and touching everyone once in a while and saying, we're not going to allow you to go wherever you want to go on this. But I will say, by not being serious about it and by doing this sort of thing, you're kind of normalizing endless gray zone conflict and sanctions without end states. You need to see it for what it is, but you also need to understand that what we're doing with Iran is really because of their nuclear latency and what they can do regionally. And certainly the humanitarian play, I think, is just a sop. And even though it would be good, and even though we absolutely abhor, just like Maduro's bad, we absolutely abhor political violence on dissent. We got to think about that as a nation. But we abhor that, and that is all true. But I think we want to just see this bigger for what it is. So when you look at that action, put it in the context of how we care about Iran, what Iran's strategy is, and how we keep it in control, but we're not focusing on it.
All right, next, Syria and ISIS. Over the past few weeks, 2 U.S. service members and a civilian interpreter were killed, and CENTCOM responded with large-scale retaliatory strikes, hitting 70-plus ISIS targets in central Syria, followed by a string of raids and missions that killed or captured nearly 25 ISIS operatives. The bigger context is the transition inside Syria. With new government still consolidating, ISIS is trying to exploit gaps in control. And policy is shifting too. The 2026 NDA, National Defense Authorization Act, repealed the CISAR Act, a major pillar of Syria sanctions, while U.S. Treasury has also moved parts of Syria sanctions into an inactive or archived posture, though targeted designation remains. Sue, what do you think about what's going on in Syria and ISIS's activities?
It was a real event. We haven't lost U.S. service members to ISIS in years, right? And so the attack was something that was new and evidence of an issue that I kind of understand the response. If I put this in our framework, it reveals a few things that we have to manage. There are actually 3 things that we're seeing that we're trying to manage from a scarcity perspective. One is our security bandwidth. Like, it is a big old dangerous world. It is. I remember when I was an intelligence officer, you'd start the year thinking what your focus was going to be. You'd do the annual threat assessment, and then you would find that those weren't the things that happened. I mean, it is a dangerous world where people have their own agenda and ability to do it. And I think this idea that we are going to be strong and dominant and, control everything through action is really going to be tested. And this was one because this is counterterrorism. Israel, there is a great concern that when we don't focus on counterterrorism, when the intelligence community reduces resources going against it by taking things away from the National Counterterrorism Center, that you're going to see this coming back, and this is one of those concerns. So got to manage that. We've made a big deal about Syria and wanting to be involved in Syria becoming a legitimate member of the international community. And so what is it, right? And then the question is, how politically patient are we going to be? So I think this event demonstrated all those imperatives, many of which are competing, all of which tax us, coming crashing in. And in a weird sort of way, a little bit like with Iran, is you almost have to do something in order to just keep your hand on it. But there is a bad precedent you set. If you're not really serious about doing something about it, you're kind of normalizing low-grade conflict. And You're saying that we're going to accept it, then we're going to be part of it, and we're going to counter it, but we're never really going to do anything about it. We're just going to keep it all simmering. And do our adversaries and competitors exploit the fact that we're just firing shots and coming back in some of these regions? And again, I think we presaged this with the national security strategy, and now you're seeing us wanting to be dominant, but having limits to how many things that we can do and how we do it. And so the consequence is we're going to allow some things to happen. And one of those is you're going to see more low-level conflict probably being allowed to go on.
Yeah, because you can't be everywhere at once, but it's the trade-off of, do you allow it to fester, and then does it boil over and affect us here on the home front and our domestic concerns?
What you're probably going to see is just continued kind of, I'm not going to say random strikes, because I think that does a disservice to our military and diplomatic planners, but I think you're going to see more episodic strikes than any kind of sustained campaign.
Well, another isolated strike was in Nigeria on Christmas Day. We talked about it a little bit in what we're watching at the end of last episode. U.S.-backed strikes in northwest Nigeria against ISIS-linked camps that Nigeria says were supporting foreign fighters filtering in from the Sahel. Pressure is rising across the Sahel belt. Militants are probing borders. Regional coordination is fractured, exactly the gaps where these groups thrive. From Senegal in the west to Eritrea, bounded to the north by the Sahara and the African tropics to the south, the Sahel has been a complex security and humanitarian environment since really the 1960s, when many of these countries gained their independence. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, 51% of global terrorism-related deaths occurred in the Sahel in 2024. I think new numbers for 2025 might be a little bit different since terrorism is more broadly defined now. But what is our message there? Is this strike an example of a show of force, high-value target strikes? Is it our Christian duty, or none of the above?
I think what it really reveals is that when insecurity, demographics, and weak governance are in play, you're going to have instability that spreads outward. I mean, that's really what the region shows. It's showed that for a long time. It's really interesting that in the first Trump administration, we withdrew from that region, much to the chagrin of regional actors who recognize the Sahel as a really difficult, complex place. I think the real message is, again, when all those factors come into play, instability and fragility turn into conflict and are security multipliers. The U.S. strategy deprioritizes regions without great power framing, and this is a great example. And so I think our interest there is even less than in others. Again, it may be an example of using some force to try and say, we're watching you. I don't like the framing at all in terms of the avenging the anti-Christian activity, because I don't think that there's great evidence that what is going on there is disproportionately anti-Christian. Every group is being terrorized. I suppose the good of this is it limits U.S. exposure, and the bad of it is it enables security vacuums that always become bigger problems for us. I mean, throughout history, I think the period 2000 to 2020 were great examples of what happens when there's a vacuum. What you're going to see is you're going to see growing Russian and militia influence, and so it is going to turn hotter, more difficult, more problematic, and a worse situation that will have to be countered at some point, whether that's in the near term or whether we can keep on doing strikes. But this is another example of, I think, using something that sounds values-based and humanitarian-based as really, we want to appear dominant and we don't want to get engaged.
Ultimately, I think it sets us up to continue to be transactional, which is what we want to be within Africa in the national security strategy, and be able to maintain enough stability there, or help Nigeria maintain enough stability there and goodwill in order to get their resource extraction and access to their oil and access to their rare earths.
We can't be everywhere, and if we're not being committed to it, then we don't want to get overly committed. This is a really complex problem to be able to solve at a distance. So this may be the exact right strategy, but we shouldn't be confused about what it is and what we can expect to see going forward. The administration presaged it. They like to be everything to everyone, and so they sometimes throw up chaff about what things are really about. I think we need to see what this is about. It's about, I don't want to be engaged in that region, but I don't want it to go horribly wrong without acting like I'm doing something.
Bingo. And just real quick before we move on, I think last week I said they were Tomahawk missile strikes. It is unclear to me whether Tomahawks were involved or not. It sounds like there was some MQ-9 and drone Hellfire type activity on these strikes. So maybe cost a little bit less than I initially thought, but still, the point remains. Move on to Israel-Gaza and talk about the second phase. Phase 1 was the ceasefire mechanics, hostage and prisoner moves, limited aid. Phase 2 is being framed as disarmament or escalation. After his meeting at Mar-a-Lago with Netanyahu, President Trump said Hamas has a short window to disarm or there will be hell to pay. At the same time, Israel is tightening rules on international aid groups, moving to suspend dozens from operating in Gaza, including Doctors Without Borders and CARE, under new registration requirements. Israel says the rules are aimed at preventing Hamas and other militant groups from infiltrating the NGOs, but they say that the rules are arbitrary. Witkoff-Kushner, who are driving the next phase for the U.S., have been tied to a glossy redevelopment concept, Project Sunrise, that imagines a long rebuild culminating in a Riviera-style coastline and high-tech infrastructure. Reports describe it as a fancy slide deck, $112 billion plus, 10 to 20 years, and which received a lot of skepticism from the target audience, the Gulf states and investors. So, Who enforces phase 2, Sue? Specifically, who disarms Hamas, with what authority, and what happens on day one a disarmament doesn't occur? The answer is hell.
And it's freezing over. It is so problematic. Of all the regions, this is the most problematic. The reality is the real play for the U.S., maybe not for this administration, but I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt, is saying it's about deterrence, credibility, and escalation control much more than it's about territory. Now, there's the shiny object of, oh my gosh, the Mediterranean coastline that could be developed, but you can't have any of that if you can't control escalation and have credible deterrence. And I think we're still far away from that. And one of the challenges to it is that Israel is such an ally in the region, and you see that over and over again. I mean, if you say that we just conducted a law enforcement activity in Venezuela to remove a criminal, why aren't we doing that in other places? And the answer is because that alliance is what is most important to us. And if you want to talk scarcity, alliances in 2026 and beyond for the U.S. right now are scarce resources. And so this is one. And so I think what you're going to see over time is, yes, we're going to hold out the hope of some economic boom, but the truth is you are still far away from credible deterrence and controlling escalation in the region. And so that's where all our energy really needs to be focused. The problem is this alliance is more important to us than anything else, and it is going to be hard to come up with a solution that only satisfies our ally. What comes next is you're going to keep on seeing flare-ups. I don't think there's a resolution in the near term, no matter how much prospect of economic development or real estate development we throw at it. How do you see it?
Yeah, it's an interesting carrot, right? But I think Hamas is going to do Hamas stuff. I think Israel's going to do Israel stuff, as they are with restricting some of the NGOs and pulling their hard line. Also, if I'm going to invest in a nice coastline, man, it seems like putting my money into Venezuela right now would be a much better option than the instability of the Middle East. Now, I think most of the hurricanes go a little further north. You do have to worry about that in the Caribbean with Venezuela, not so much in the Med, but just in terms of regional stability and being able to get a return on that investment, I think Venezuela looks way more appealing right now than the Gaza Riviera.
And I think it's a real desire of this administration in every region in which we're engaged is to look at the resources, whether it's real estate or oil or something else that we can gain, because we see that as something that we have some sort of right to. All I'm saying is that the path to getting there is impeded because of Israel's absolutism on what it is they will accept and they won't, and our dependence on that alliance regionally. Any sort of peace or resolution that we can get to, because that alliance is so important to us, and it will continue to be the thing, no matter what we say, no matter who we engage with or who we threaten, that will be a huge piece of what we do, and I think we should watch that and watch how flare-ups are managed.
Well, let's talk about some other strong folks. We'll first look at China. China just ran a new round of large-scale drills called Justice Mission 2025 that looked like a blockade quarantine playbook, military activity positioned to encircle Taiwan and pressure its ports and sea lanes. The U.S. called the activity an unnecessary spike in tensions and urged Beijing to stop the pressure campaign, while Taiwan kept up readiness without trying to overreact. As we've seen with the blockade of oil in Latin America, a blockade is a coercion tool you can dial up and dial down, short of war, but still high consequence. So what was your reaction to this recent drill?
It's the boiling frog that mainland China is effecting against Taiwan. Just seeing how far it can go, take advantage of economic entanglement with the U.S. and kind of ambiguity about how strong we're going to be toward them. Xi has his own imperatives, and he has made reunification one of the things that he needs to do. I've long said that it's only in his head what the time frame for that will be. I think what's interesting with the action in Venezuela, I do worry that it's a really interesting time for mischief by Xi with respect to Taiwan, because our moral authority is certainly eroded with the regional kind of argument that what happens in our region is ours to control and you need to stay out of that. That said, China is continuing to pursue its objectives. I think it does it by inching closer to actions that are just below a threshold. It is enabled by U.S. policy that does not want conflict with China, even though it tries to be strong against it. But it will be tempered by the fact that we really rely on that infrastructure in terms of a supply chain issue with chips and things. So it'll be interesting to see if I were a concerned China about the strength of my leadership, Xi, in face of a difficult economic circumstance that he certainly has within his own country. I might be looking for my own wag the dog scenario where I go ahead and buttress my reputation by taking action against Taiwan, counting on the fact that the U.S. doesn't want to get involved militarily, and it would be a pretty easy action right now. So it represents what China has been trying to do. I think the timing is interesting, and I think the thing to watch for is, does she decide that this is a time? Do they escalate? And what would we actually do about it right now, given our stated global view, which is if you control a region, you ought to be able to control all the things that happen there. I think this one's worrisome. I think it's worrisome just because the consequence is huge if it goes horribly wrong. And that's huge economically, not just militarily or politically.
That's true. But haven't you said recently that you don't think he's militarily ready, or that they're not military ready for that action? But if our reaction is reduced,
that's my point.
Yeah.
It's just an equation. A minute ago, you basically have Indo-PACOM being the focus of our energy, saying that we're really determined in that region in order to be a buttress against adventurism. I don't know that you're hearing that as much anymore. I don't think anything has happened to make it less an objective on Xi. I think he is under a lot of pressure. His term is ending. Is his posture in 26 altogether different from what it will be in 27 when we did assess that he might be ready? So I think it bears watching. But I think from a U.S. perspective, the region is important because of supply chain and economic entanglement, but it really isn't a fight that we have the bandwidth to take on. It certainly isn't the easy fight that Venezuela was.
No. Well, and the Beijing said it was deeply shocked and strongly condemned the U.S. use of force in Venezuela, calling it a serious violation of international law and Venezuela's sovereignty, and urging the U.S. to abide by the UN Charter. China is a major economic backer of Venezuela, including oil trade and past energy sector investment. Reuters citing $1.6 billion in goods trade in 2024, about half of that crude oil. Do you have any additional thoughts on their relationship, the China and Venezuela? I know you alluded to it earlier.
China's strategy goes to the global south. Their Belt and Road Initiative goes through there, and they are entrenched. The U.S. may seek to deny it, but again, you're denying it with a regime that is not necessarily strong enough to hold to any agreements or decide, yeah, I want to align with the U.S., I'm going to kick China out, because China has tremendous power too. The global south is important to China. Given their economic weakness, look how much they've invested in it. We are counting on a denial strategy with a regime that isn't super strong against counter-coercive powers.
Yep. Highest bidder. The mother of them all, Russia, Ukraine. Russia's defense ministry claims Ukraine has targeted Moscow daily since January 1st, leaning harder into strategic disruption, logistics, energy, air traffic. And then Reuters reported a 200-plus Russian drone attack on New Year's that hit power infrastructure across multiple regions in Ukraine, knocking out electricity for tens of thousands. This is kind of Russia's winter playbook: pressure the population by taking away their lights and heat. Moscow is calling the U.S. operation in Venezuela armed aggression and pushing the legality fight into the UN, a sovereignty argument from the very actor rewriting borders in Europe. So do you think our operations in Venezuela lend credibility to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
I think they'll frame it that way, but I think more likely what we're seeing is almost a purposeful U.S. strategy of doing just enough to support Ukraine that we don't allow the absolute takeover, but attrition is okay, right? Kind of keeping it on the burner. If we keep it a war of attrition, it weakens Russia as well. So in a weird sort of way, everything old is new again. We've seen this playbook where things happen, counter moves. The president invites President Zelensky to Mar-a-Lago. They have a talk. They say, the real discussions were made on security guarantees, and then something happens. Russia says that it's been wrong. The U.S. blames Zelensky for escalating. But I think if we just kind of lift ourselves up just a little bit, I think what we're seeing is a purposeful U.S. strategy that says we're going to do just enough to keep it from being an absolute takeover and keep the attrition working in our favor on both fronts. Now, again, for me, I think the assault on free and open societies, I think the things that are happening in Europe, in the border countries that have not yet decided to whom they're going to look for security guarantees, it's really problematic with this approach. But I think what we are seeing is the approach that's emerging. Again, there's a lot of bad to this, and this is where, and that it kind of normalizes. You were talking at the very beginning of the session about normalizing behaviors. I think this normalizes long-term proxy warfare, taking things over. And this is where I think the U.S. and Venezuela hurts us, because how do you stand up to that? And then you go into the UN where we're unlikely to do well anyway. The 10,000-foot view is that all that is noise going back and forth. The truth is that this administration's strategy toward Russia is to basically let it be a war of attrition. You can't get the end you want, and so just weaken everybody at the same time.
Yeah, that was our criticism of the Biden administration, too, was just giving Ukraine enough not to lose. I wonder, we've added into the NDAA. Europe also passed a lot of funding for 2 years. Is this kind of in our best interest to have Russia occupied for the next 2 years with all their attention in Ukraine instead of causing mischief elsewhere?
Maybe from a first order effect.
Yeah.
I think from a second and third order effect, is the world better off with the powerful doing what the powerful wants with impunity? I don't think so.
Better off, or that's just reality.
It does seem to be where we are. And I think that's what I hope people are getting from this, is we're trying to get us to see it rather than Sue wishing she were president so she could decide how we approach these things. But so, yeah, I like this discussion because I think it allows people to not be hyperbolic and choose one side or the other, but really recognize that all these actions have consequences. And I think one of the biggest things that I see is, do I think these actions are in America's best interest? That's a big question. And it's one you're hearing on all the pundits. Is this good for America? Well, on one hand, a strong America, in all the areas of making sure that we're resilient and we have resources and that we're not being threatened, that is an interest. It is not necessarily making Americans' lives better. I worry that it's enriching a few, and that we haven't seen any evidence that any of these actions have actually resulted in something better for our citizenry. But we shouldn't be too myopic about what is in America's interests or not, just because it's not improving the lives of everyday Americans. Two things are true, however. Number one, this administration was elected not on economic imperialism, not on being the world's policeman and taking bad leaders out of power, but rather on improving the lives of Americans and giving us a better educational foundation and increasing our digital infrastructure and doing a lot of things. It sold itself on that, and that is not what it's delivering immediately. And the other thing is, I don't think there's been any real conversation with the American people about the choices we're making or how this strategy is being affected. And I think they're trying to not have that conversation by couching a lot of these actions in terms that sound like old values, but in fact are not values-based, or not old values-based.
All right. Well, that's it. 7 or 8 areas, hotspots, a lot going on. How do we wrap this up?
2 ways. One, I think we've said this for the whole year. Watch actions, not words. There are going to be a lot of words being said by a lot of people, including us. Watch actions, not words. Scarcity explains current behavior better than values does. And precedent probably matters more than stated intentions. Those are 3 kind of substantive wrap-ups. And then I think, kind of segueing to what we're watching, I think Venezuela and Greenland are going to be the thing we're watching in the short term to see how it really shakes out from that immediate, very smooth, very amazing military action and turns into the effect that we want to achieve, who gets the money, who gets the green light to go in.
Right.
And I think Greenland is going to be a really interesting test mouse to see whether it really is about security and the American people or whether it really is about just straight up power. So kind of how Greenland falls next is going to be interesting. And what's the world going to do? We are remarkable as a nation in our capabilities. We are. We have resources. We've invested in them. We have humans that are much more than automatons. They affect judgment. I mean, there are just so many great things about us. But let's not be confused. There are other people that are going to have a say in this. It'll be interesting to see how that goes forward.
That's what we're watching. That's how we see it. And thank you for joining us. No doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
We're so excited to start a second year with you, and we'd love to hear what you think of both our direction, focus, and insight. It's the conversation that we really want, even though we'll take your adulation. Please follow the link to give some feedback on anything. And join us next week for Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another because everyone is fighting the great battle.
Pull the thread. Where's it go? All right, run it down. Headlines hit like sparks in the rain. Everybody's talking, but it all sounds the same. We don't do noise, we don't do spin. We look for the crack where the truth gets in. Follow the money, follow the leverage. Ignore the silence, who gained advantage when normal falls through and you can't trust the status. That's when you run toward the sound of chaos. Cause the signal's hiding in the seams. Human choice is human dreams. One small trade-off, one bent rule, and the future starts to shift its groove. It's a romp around the world, yeah, a romp around the world. And a group of otters, that's a romp, haven't you? We're chasing down the wide beneath the world. Turn the context into something you can hold. It's a romp around the world. Power hates a vacuum, fear loves a crowd. Plans look perfect till reality's loud. Everybody wants the easy line, but consequences never that kind. So we scan the edges, read the tells, watch the bridges, hear warning bells. If you want a lead, not a scroll, come ride the ripple to the hole. Cause the signal's hiding in the seams. Human costs and human schemes. One small trade-off, one closed door, and the map don't match the myth anymore. It's a romp around the world, yeah, a romp around the world. And a group of otters, that's a romp, haven't you? Chasing down the wide beneath the world. Turn the context into something you can hold. It's a romp around the world. Roll! No dips! Roll! No hot takes! Signal! No solutions! Trade off! No sheep people! It's a romp!